Hey, AP Govers. All right, here's your quick flipped lecture on these two Supreme Court cases in case you don't feel confident with either of them, okay? So we're, again, talking about federalism, and we're specifically looking at devolution of the 1990s, which is a departure from a strong central government and the Supreme Court ruling in favor of a strong central government and pushing the power back to the states. So in our first case, we see a strong central government reigning. In 1819, in the McCulloch v. Maryland case, remember the United States Congress had created a bank, and the bank was created so that Congress could regulate trade between the states. They could hold their money in the bank. And the state of Maryland had tried to tax the federal bank. And the first thing that was decided in this Supreme Court case was that because Congress has the right to regulate trade between the states, interstate trade, or the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, then the bank was legal as a extension of this particular responsibility. So you probably studied the necessary and proper clause in your U.S. history classes. We'll be looking at that again in our AP government class. But basically what the Supreme Court ruled was the bank was necessary and proper for Congress to carry out their responsibility of regulating trade between the states, Commerce Clause, okay? So this is a broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause and a broad interpretation of allowing the federal government to take more power than maybe you would have otherwise per the Constitution if it was read literally. Commerce was used, this broad interpretation of commerce was used throughout all the way until the 1990s to give the federal government power in areas where they may not have had power previously. So, for example, in the 1960s, civil rights legislation that required the desegregation of restaurants was passed, and Congress said they had the ability to do this because of the Commerce Clause. So they assumed that if you had a restaurant and you were segregating your restaurant, that might hurt interstate commerce, trade between the states. And therefore, Congress had the jurisdiction or the authority to pass civil rights legislation that forced desegregation of your private restaurant, all because of the Commerce Clause. So hopefully you can see this is a broad, maybe overly broad interpretation of Congress's responsibility to regulate trade between the states and giving them jurisdiction to do other legislation, all under the guise of the Commerce Clause. Fast forward to the 1990s, and I told you all three branches had a concerted effort to push the power, the strong central power, back to the states through devolution, it was called. Okay, devolution is the term for that. So in this particular case, a high schooler brought a gun to school. Okay, and the state tried him. They were going to try him in state courts. And the federal government had passed this law. I always forget the name, and you don't need to remember it either, but I'm going to highlight it here for you. I don't know if it switched over to the other screen. Maybe it didn't. The Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1990. And the Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1990 basically said that you couldn't bring a gun to school because bringing a gun to school might hurt interstate commerce, trade between the states. So the federal government here is basically saying, well, we get to regulate trade between the states, and even though education isn't our jurisdiction, if someone brought a gun to school, it might negatively impact interstate trade, which is a huge, huge kind of overreach, right? It doesn't seem like those two things go together. But the federal government said they could do it because they had the power to regulate commerce. So the Supreme Court, in looking at this case, which again the federal government took jurisdiction over, said we're going to try this student based on this particular law. Supreme Court was trying to decide if that Gun-Free Safe School Zone Act, or whatever it's called, was constitutional or not. Is that an overreach of Congress's power, or can they make this law because of their right to regulate commerce? And what the Supreme Court of the 1990s decided was bringing a gun to school has nothing to do with commerce, has nothing to do with interstate trade. Bringing a gun to school is not going to hurt interstate trade, and therefore this is an overreach of the federal government's power. Commerce Clause does not apply. It's not Congress who should regulate safe schools, but rather the states, because education is a state responsibility. So the Supreme Court's not saying it's okay for Lopez to bring a gun to school. They're saying it's not the federal government's job to decide. It's up to the states to regulate safety in schools, because school safety has nothing to do with the Commerce Clause. Okay, so we see a devolution or a pushing back of power from a strong federal government to strong state government, so pushing of power, devolution. Bill Clinton is famously quoted in the 1990s as saying, the era of big government is over. This is another example of devolution. Okay, so there's your two cases. You don't need to turn in the case briefings that you did for those today, but you should have them in your notes. You're going to need to know these two cases and a whole bunch of others. There are 15 for our course. So I hope this helps. Thanks, guys.